anyone who has ever raised children will testify that nothing compares to the moment when your kid starts to page through a book by themselves in silence. That moment is incredible. The only thing that comes close is wiping their own butts. You know what I mean. So we've come to Pécs, the south of Hungary, to talk in the local library about children's literature.
Do you still enjoy reading those children's books?
Oh, especially after a full day of work. I don't want to see anything else.
Exactly. The bending of the children's book, it has always been there.
A lot of adults are hiding behind this really nice, comfortable blanket of, I want to protect children. I don't think any of this is about protecting children, because if we really wanted to do that, we would take away the phones.
Hi. Early literary education starts not when we actually teach children letters and how to read them together. It starts way before, and ultimately it's both a familiarity with literacy, with books, with written materials, and also creating a motivation in them to want to read. Otherwise, reading is just a chore that they will abandon the second they can, right? Now, as developed cultures, we're struggling not just with a huge drop in reading due to changing technologies, but also increasing rates of secondary illiteracy. So when people actually can recognize letters, but their stability in reading and reading comprehension isn't satisfactory, doesn't serve them well enough. And especially with the increase in technology use, this can become a huge problem. Children's libraries, all kinds of libraries, but especially children's libraries and reading programs serve a huge function in providing a stable foundation. But having dedicated literature for children is actually a relatively new thing, although we will contest this in today's discussion. But dedicated literature for children that's specifically tailored to them, I would say has been around like a good 200 years, right? Because literature, both read and perceived through hearing, so like oral traditions, including epic poems and fairy tales, all kinds of tales, family stories, they have always been more a communal experience than anything else, where children participate, but they are not the focus. With the pedagogic revolution of the 19th and 20th century, or revolutions in pedagogy in the 19th and 20th century, this has changed. This focus has gradually shifted onto children. But this is not literature restricted to children. Some of these books are incredible to behold for any age group. So today we talk with authors of children's books, illustrators, and we wonder whether this distinction between children's literature and adult literature still holds, whether there's any grounds for this. Is children's literature still a literary ghetto, or are these boundaries now more permissible? And whether this reading drop can actually be addressed through somehow specifically this genre.
Of course, children's books are no children's games when we're talking numbers. We are talking about a $13 billion industry, at least in 2024. Today, our guests to talk about this industry are Chrysogonus Siddha Malilang, who is a senior lecturer at Malmö University in Sweden and the current editor of Bookbird. He's a researcher in children's literature and education, as well as a creative writer and a translator. Írisz Agócs is a Hungarian illustrator and author. After studying cultural anthropology and ethnography, she switched to illustration, especially enjoying children's illustrations and slightly grotesque themes. Liv Andrea Banner is a Danish writer who grew up in Aarhus and recently completed a degree in creative writing and Irish literature in Sligo. Her debut novel, Guild Society, was published in 2025. Hello, welcome, and thanks so much for taking the time to talk with me about children's literature and young adults literature. We're going to focus a bit more on children today, but in order to make this distinction, I thought maybe we can start with Liv. You recently published an exciting book, and I want to ask you about the process. So when you set out to write a novel, do you have a specific target audience in mind? Because children's literature and adolescent literature tends to have a very specific register. Do you already have this in mind, or do you just write and then edit, or how does this work?
Being a writer was not something I really intended to do when I came into literature. I have worked in the film industry for quite a while, and then I got an idea, and that idea became a book. So it wasn't as straightforward as thinking of a target audience or thinking about what type of book I wanted to write. I think I know that that's what the industry typically asks of creators, is to figure out who are you creating for. If you think too much about your target audience, you often set up boundaries for yourself, and that impacts the literature in I think, quite an awful way.
Yeah, I mean, I still haven't made up my mind who the target audience of this show is, and people keep asking me, and I just lie something else every time. Does this develop in an interaction with your editor? So you have ideas, you have a text. I guess you don't have like a ready-made novel and then look for an editor.
I was very lucky that I'm 23, and I found an editor who's 25. And typically when you're writing, especially as a young person, people, with more experience than you think they have the answers for you. But in this collaboration with someone who was closer to my age, it was easier to have a conversation about it. I never felt like my editor tried to impose a target audience on my work. As a creator, you shouldn't try to find your target audience. Your target audience should find you. And then as a creator, it's your job to accept the people who relate to your material. I don't think I wrote my book with young adults in mind, but they seem to really take to it, and they seem to really like it. So for me, I need to open my arms to them as my target group.
Írisz, tell us about how you became, you're an anthropologist by trade or by training. How did you end up as a children's writer and mostly very prolific illustrator?
Oh, I have a very strong artist family. So my plan was not to be an artist.
Oh, okay. That was your rebellion?
Yeah.
Well, congratulations, you made it.
Yeah. So I thought that to create anything, it's very personal and very intimate. So I didn't want to show myself for the wide public. So I choose not to go to art school, and because my grandpa was a professor of ethnography, I thought that's a good idea to follow him in university. I always do illustrating jobs, so I never stopped to draw. And finally, I have to face with this fact that I cannot not to be an illustrator.
This is the classic hero's journey. You're trying to escape from your talent and it catches up with you. That's just your fate, yeah. Right? And you also, in some of your books, you actually teach children to draw, or sort of an attitude to drawing. Can you tell us about how this came about? The title literally said, "Draw a potato," and that's kind of the starting point for your figures.
Let's draw a potato. It's also another strange story, because I never want to teach anyone to draw, because I think everyone can draw, and I want to prove it through this process. The joy of the drawing is the main goal. That's my idea, and that's what I want to prove through this potato drawing process. And the main idea that you can start with anything, a circle, a square, and even a potato, if you use the main characteristic lines. If you put huge ears on it, it will be a rabbit. That's quite sure. So I use this, and the success is in it, surely, that everyone will have the same animal if we start with this very small and simple steps.
Yeah, it's fail-proof, right? So
It is. I have the responsibility that if I promise that it will be a rabbit, it will be a rabbit, and it doesn't matter what kind of potato you draw. So the trick in it that everyone has the very unique own rabbit at the end, because it started with a very special potato. No one drew the same. So yeah, it's a tricky, not teaching.
I like this. I mean, a spud is a spud, and none of them are alike, and whatever you associate with a potato, it's going to be different for everyone. So that's a lovely one, but they have eyes everywhere. So beware. I want to ask you, Chris, about a bit of an industry perspective. Book reading has very rapidly dropped in the past, let's say, 2 decades. But children's books are a booming industry. What my publisher told me a couple of years ago is that the 2 spheres where they are actually really successful are cookbooks and children's books. Why are children's books so impressively growing, especially because it's a relatively young genre?
I think in a way it's a bit unfair to say that children's book is a relatively new genre, because children's book has always been there. It's just we did not really call it children's literature. Back in the 19th century, for examples, we did not really have children's literature, but those are the books that we generally refer, or that people generally refer to as the family literature. So those are the books that the family buy and then they can read together, both the adults and the children's. And alongside, as time goes by, and also with the industry growing, then people start calling it children's literature. They have this specific quality which scholars call as the dual audience, that it will also be read by adults, that both children's and adults, they can actually enjoy the same children's book. It's just they're going to have a different interpretations. The reason why I study children's literature, the reason why I go into children's literature, is because I actually still enjoy reading those children's books. If I return these questions to all 3 of you, do you still enjoy reading those children's books?
Oh, especially after a full day of work. I don't want to see anything else.
Exactly. There's this kind of a pleasures of reading children's book, that it is fun, it is warming. It for adult, it is also something that allows them to become children. I actually tend to see that in the last 5 years or so, there is a tendency for people to actually go back into the analog technologies. So these are like some of the elements that actually make the booming of children's literature, that push the booming of children's literature industry in the last couple of years.
I understand your point, and I also agree that this is literature for everyone. However, if I look at the kind of literature that you would typically be confronted with as a child 200 years ago, but if you think about folk tales, fairy tales, even epic poems, these are incredibly heavy literature that a community confronts with, and the kids are expected to get used to not understanding 2/3 of it, being overwhelmed, especially fairy tales and older children's literature tends to be very disciplinarian.
As adults introducing children to literature, we also need to give them a little bit more credit than they're due in terms of understanding and in terms of being able to follow a story. My parents were very good at exposing me to like a lot of different literature and not necessarily traditional children's literature. I think the beauty of a lot of the children's literature is how it's the same kind of stories, just formatted differently. This shield of children's literature that allows us to process the grievances of the world is not just of use to children, but especially for at use for adults as well.
Yeah, I think it is also interesting, Reka, that you also mentions about older children's literature and you use the fairy tales, because like fairy tales, they were not exactly made for children's. Fairy tales are actually made to preserve the cultures. It's more like how you transfer the values, how you transfer the cultural rules through metaphoric stories. And you are also correct in a way that children's literature or children's stories have also changed, because if we take a look at like old like Victorian literature aim or targeted towards children's, most of them will actually portray the children's only as the silent characters, that the children's are supposed to be seen but not heard. And these were all changed. I think one of the famous trigger for the change or revolutions in children's literature is the publications of Alice in Wonderland. Because I think before Alice in Wonderland, one always think of children's literature is a story that will teach children about something. But then I guess this is like a question that I can also ask all three of you. What is actually the lesson of Alice in Wonderland?
For me, the most important thing that I took away from it is it has this amazing depiction of how confusing and nonsensical the adult world is that you have to navigate, and people demand that you understand without explaining.
Yeah, I mean, it is about like getting lost in the pleasures of nonsense. That like I mean, it becomes. I mean, nonsense is also sometimes nonsense also means that there were too many sense, there were too many meanings that we cannot process. But and that's the thing. Like we get so engulfed in all of these things, we kind of enjoy all of these things. We kind of enjoy all of these pleasures. Why does children's literature always need to teach something? Because if we talk about adult literature, do you actually, as an adult, do we actually read literature to learn about the moral value, or do we actually read literature because we want to find some pleasures?
Yeah. But I think books can become accessories in some ways for adults. Like we're very obsessed with image these days, and a way of creating identities also to tell people what kind of literature we're into. Just going back to Alice in Wonderland, there's also that wonderful quote that I think the Mad Hatter says, "What's the difference between a raven and a writing desk?" It's a satirical take on, I guess, intellect in some ways.
Hmm.
Like you're saying, why does everything need to have a meaning and a moral and a lesson?
The Mad Hatter always reminded me of Immanuel Kant, but maybe that's just my weird relationship with Kant. Who knows? Today's conversation is hosted by the Gyozo Csorba Country Library in Pécs in the south of Hungary. The central campus combines a public library and a university library in the same stunning building of nearly 13,000 square meters and has a complete collection of over 1 million volumes. As you can hear, we're huge fans of this library, so check them out and maybe visit their literary festival in the autumn. Link is in the show notes. And now back to the program. Let me ask you this very uncomfortable thing and come to you first, Írisz. For a long time, literature intended for children and theater intended for children was considered a sort of literary ghetto. It feels like we're saying that then pediatricians are not real doctors, they're just children playing doctors, which isn't the case, right?
I don't know. Some people, or maybe lots of people, think that if you drawing for children, it means you cannot draw proper, serious pictures, but it's not true. You have to learn everything in drawing, all the techniques, drawing portraits or anything, and after you start to make it for your own style, or use it more simple, like symbols.
The weird thing is that the type of illustration that you do lives almost on every page in like the whole physical realm of the book, whereas illustrations in, say, an adult novel, they are very confined usually, like apart from comic books, which are this interesting sort of intermediary genre, even though most comic books are not at all for children whatsoever. But your graphic work is actually more expansive in a way, as in a kiterjedtebb, as opposed to, say, illustration in, I don't know, I can't really imagine what would be an illustration for War and Peace. Maybe people sitting in a room over tea and being very anxious.
I don't know why this idea, I have no idea. I mean, I just find to more joyful to illustrate for children, and I think because I like to draw very quickly, or I enjoy the process that I'm drawing. For me, these kind of short stories or poems,
or maybe this is exactly the flow that you actually sort of meld into the process. But maybe we can come to Chris, because you also mentioned that some people in your family have been prodding you while you still read children's literature.
I have to say that there has been a lot of changes in children's literature since I started studying children's literature in 2010. That right now it has become more and more established. But I remember when I started studying children's literature, I get all of these questions like, wait, why are you studying children's literature? Why don't you study like the real literature? Like, these are real literature. And but then I always reply to that with the questions. But what do you mean with literature? What is your understanding of literature? So here's basically they try to undermine me, but I usually just go into a very serious mode in going back into the idea of the root word of literature. Did you know that literature actually comes from the old word called grammatica literatura, which means everything which is written? So why do you have to differentiate like the high literature and the non-high literature, or like the canon literature and the non-canon literature? Like, we don't really differentiate between like good literature and bad literature. There was even this joke among us, the children's literature scholars, that I'm this might be offensive to some people who enjoy this text, but we all agree that, I mean, Twilight is not exactly a good text. But we agree.
How could you say that? I never read a page.
I haven't finished. Lots of people think that Twilight is not a good text, but it does not mean that Twilight is not literature, because Twilight is important in literature, even in like young adult and children's literature, because the publications of Twilight actually starts the publications of all the spiritual romance, or like the spiritual genres in young adult literature. So it is important. It is still part of the literature. It's just like some people might not enjoy it. That's why we say that it's not a good literature. But then good literature or bad literature, that's basically mostly also, it can also be like pretty subjective. I mean, for me myself, I don't enjoy reading that one, but I always bring that one up every time I discuss children's literature, because it is an important milestone in children's literature or in young adult literature.
Liv, you're not only an author who published a book that's sort of labeled as young adult, but you are a young adult yourself. Is this literary ghetto around you? Do people take you as seriously as you want them to? Or how do you feel about this?
Oh, I think I'm really happy to be asked this question, and I think it's important to say I'm very new in this industry, so I'm still kind of figuring things out. But for my book, we're at a boarding school, and we're following a principal and a student, one chapter at a time. And what I found was that writing the chapters from the point of view of an older man actually came quite easily. And then going back and writing for a woman closer to my age, it was hard because I found myself slip into what I thought was cliche and what I thought was less important than the chapters for the older man. I try not to label my book because, again, like I said, I would love for all types of people to pick it up and read it. And I feel very lucky that I've gotten responses also from older readers as well. But what they have in common is that they all say, oh yeah, I kind of skipped over Ellen's chapters to get to Robert, to get to the real important stuff. And I'm kind of wondering why, because we've all been 17.
Look, I can tell you why I have a hard time reading about the feelings of a 17-year-old. And it's because I remember being 17 and it was miserable. It was horrifying. It was probably the hardest thing. And I've been through some stuff, I mean, I have sisters. That's a tough point. So maybe it's specifically because these feelings are so deep and so genuine that you sort of get distance from it. And then if you start to relate to them, you actually have to live them.
Yeah, it is also interesting because I remember reading a lot of discussions about Heartstoppers. Heartstopper, it is a graphic novels for teenagers, but I do. It was interesting to come across this discussions from the older gay men that they think like, okay, I'm not going to read this one because this is basically just a cliche gay stories. But then the moment the moment they read that, they felt that they they felt happy and sad at the same times, because for them it is something that they never had when they were teenagers.
I'm so happy you bring this in, because then it takes us to another very grim thing that I wanted to ask you about. And that's the ever more prolific bans and censorship on children's and young adults literature that's spreading, I would say, in a lot of places. Let's just stick to that. How do you feel about this? What's your experience? I don't know, Írisz, if you want to talk about this. Recently in Hungary, certain types of content was penalized, and now it has to be sort of foiled up, and people under 18 are not supposed to be able to open the book in the bookshop.
Yeah, I think it's a nonsense. I think a foil won't stop anything, hopefully. And I also hope that no one will be afraid of to just tear up that foil. I think it's really sad still. I think it helps to find, okay, it has foil, so it must be interesting. I think it's it's a really good marketing. That.
Yeah, I mean, I taught literature for a very short while, and teaching Madame de Bovary to 17-year-olds, I mean, that's a saucy task. And when nobody wanted to read it, I just gave them the task to find me and tell me the exact number of sex scenes in the books, which is all of the book.
You have to put into a foil.
Nobody had an adequate count on Madame de Bovary. And that's just high school curriculum. But Chris, I'm pretty sure that IB is confronted with this phenomenon all the time. What do you see? Is there really a trend emerging, or are these like isolated cases?
I wouldn't say that this is an emerging trend, because like the banning of the children's book, it has always been there. I mean, say for example, back in the 90s and the 70s, we also have the banning of "Are You There, God? It's Me, Margaret," which is a book about like a girl dealing with puberty, and some people think that this is scandalous. Children should never read about menstruation's blood. And isn't this basically why this book is there? That this book is there to help them to feel that, well, they're not alone. That there are also other people experiencing this one. And I actually like what Liv said earlier, that we should not underestimate the young readers, because for me, like the banning of the book, actually, it is the manifestations of adult people trying to control what the children should and should not read. That, okay, I mean, according to Immanuel Kant, everyone actually has the capacity already to think for themselves what is right and what is wrong, and that is also the case with the children, that they also have their own moral compass. Just because they read something which they don't agree does not mean that they will automatically subscribe to that. It might actually be something for them to think about. That
I feel like there is also this attempt to strongly control a medium that is much mild or tends to be much milder than what actually surrounds them. And this then takes me to technology, because I have this little magic device usually in my pocket or in my bag. There is all the violence and gore and all the pornos that you can imagine. I know because I checked. And so most of our children have access to all kinds of content that doesn't even come on the same page with the things that are being censored in this literature, simply because this is a physical object that I can decide to buy for them or take away from them. But in another way, there's this huge disconnect. Liv, how do you feel about this?
Oof, I have a lot to say. I think, first of all, just to talk about the idea of banning books, no democracy has ever survived once it started banning books, and that doesn't matter which books. I think Harry Potter is a really interesting case because it's both been banned by the left and the right wing. And I also think that a lot of adults are hiding behind this really nice, comfortable blanket of, I want to protect children. I don't think any of this is about protecting children, because if we really wanted to do that, we would take away the phones. I remember I was 13 when I wrote my first novel and I wanted to get it published. And this was right about the time that YouTube was huge, and you saw YouTubers publishing books which, dare I say, didn't have a lot to offer. And I remember feeling extremely frustrated that the digitalized world was suddenly infiltrating literature in this manner. So I think maybe I'm the wrong young person to ask.
You're the only young person that is willing to talk to us, so we have to make do with you. Everybody else is on their phones, I'm sorry to say. I want to bring up the issue of canons that Chris has already brought in. How do you see, for instance, international publications of children's literature?
the reception of book can actually be very different in one country to another. As someone who grew up in Indonesia, I actually grew up with lots of Init Blyton books. I don't know. I believe that Liv might actually be familiar with those books, and like one of my favorite series was actually the Mallory Towers, because it is about the school stories. I love school stories, but I know that like Enid Blyton her book was not very big in Sweden, but then in Indonesia it was very big. And then another thing, it is also a book that I'm currently working on. It is also part of my childhood. It was a very big book it was a very big English book written by a British author, taking place in Antwerp, Belgium. And that book was very big in East Asia. But in Britain and in Belgium itself, people barely hear about that book. It's a book called A Dog of Flanders. And interestingly, like lots of tourists from East Asia came to Antwerp because they grew up with this story, but like people in Antwerp, they know nothing about this Dog of Flanders until in the 1980s, the city government of Antwerp decided to make two statues based on these stories, because lots of tourists kept asking them about this book.
Yeah, I feel like also there are advantages to having a lingua franca, but there's also still this overwhelming dominance of English language literature, or I would say native English literature everywhere else. Liv, how you as like a, grown up entirely digitally, in the sense that, you grew up in a thoroughly digitized society from the get-go. Do you see this changing with the generations?
Oof. I think, first of all, about the canon. I also agree with Chris. We can't have a common canon, and we shouldn't. We should be curious about other people's reading experiences and the differing of book cultures in different countries. And I think for my own experience, first of all, it's important to say that I grew up bilingual, so I have always spoken Danish and English. But even in Denmark, when I was young, you were watching the American and British TV, and they had, they were dubbing the TV shows until 7 o'clock. From 7 o'clock, everything was in English. So that also forced the English language into Denmark and into Danish children in a very interesting manner, because it was, if you want to watch your shows, you gotta learn English. I think that is part of why people might not be interested in learning other languages, because you can just speak English together. But now that I've lived in Ireland for 3 years, I will say that this is kind of turning. There's a wonderful new focus on native languages. Like where I lived in Sligo, everyone speaks English and you're able to communicate that, but the country as a whole is trying to take Ausgelge back their native Irish language, and it's especially a movement driven by young people who are craving identity. And I think that it's a really beautiful movement, and I'm really excited to see where it goes. Um, but it's also just important to remember this idea of English, and even us speaking English right now is still also a relatively young movement. My dad was born in the 50s and doesn't speak English very well, but he speaks German and he speaks French and he speaks Danish. But as soon as he arrives in Ireland, people assume that he's not educated very well because he doesn't speak English. But it just wasn't the focus at the time. And I also think that that's very interesting. You go to East Asian countries, people often have 3 languages.
I want to ask you, Írisz, about a translation or a transfiguration between your graphic world and generally the sort of graphic world that you create in, and animation, because that's also a huge translation step. How do you perceive this?
I was part in a short animated movie, and also there is an animation from a series that Judith Berg wrote. I don't know the English title
just
of
say
that.
the Hungarian, we'll put it there.
Cipelőcicák. In Hungary we don't have it yet, but I don't know which country. It's a huge series, I don't know, 16 parts or something, and it's based on my characters and the whole created world, but now it's a digital illustration. I like to draw different movements, so I think it's easy to I don't know, work with it. The only difficultness is the watercolor.
Yeah, okay, but I want conflict. Is there like a class struggle between animation and graphics in books? Everything has ruined books for the children. Video killed the radio star. All of that.
I don't know, because I'm not really in any kind of digital stuff. So, yeah, I think for a small child, it's a lot better to watch still pictures and not animated, because it's lots of pictures in very small period of time, and I think it's not good for small ones.
I was hoping you would do an all-out attack on Baby Shark or something, or Paw Patrol, but we didn't get there. I'm very sorry. I actually don't hate Paw Patrol. I'm one of those few people who doesn't hate them.
There has been a lot of concerns right now that younger generations don't read, or younger generations do not like to read, I think it's not because they can't read. And I think this is also something that lots of people start to think, that to be able to make them read, we need to teach them how to read. But I think when you teach young people, when you teach young reader to read too much, they will start to see reading as something that they need to do to get grades, or something that they need to do because they have to in schools. You actually need to remember that you need to also develop their reading pleasures, and to remind them that when they read the book, it is actually a form of play in their own mind, that they're not just reading the book because you will ask them questions about what do you understand about this book, but you need to teach them how to read the book, and like being able to engage with the book.
Yeah, well said. And I just wanted to add to that Patti Smith, in her novel Devotion, which is about her relationship with writing, describes exactly that phenomenon of going back to a book and not being able to find a specific scene because
Hmm.
it was never there. That was your brain working while reading. And so I think that's something that also it especially happens in children, but it's also hopefully a mechanism that we keep as adults when we engage in literature.
Thank you all so much. It's been very exciting for me. I hope it wasn't horrible for you, which is
I hope not.
It was really good.
all of my one night stands. Thank you so much.
So, which was your favorite children's book? Please tell us in the comments below, and while you're already rummaging down there, give us a like and subscribe to the channel. Standard Time is a Eurozine production. This show is powered by Display Europe, a platform for multilingual content on European politics and culture. Check them out at displayeurope.eu. Our media partners are OktoTV in Austria and Átlátszó in Hungary. This project is co-funded by the EU and the European Cultural Foundation. The views and opinions expressed here are those of the authors and the speakers only. They do not necessarily reflect those of the European Union or the European Education and Culture Executive Agency. Neither the European Union nor the EACA can be held responsible for them. Thank you to the Gyozo Csorba Country Library for hosting us.